Hello, everyone. I'm Pauline Davies, and on behalf of Arizona State University, I want to offer a very warm welcome to our guests from all over the world to the 2021 Conference on Religion, Ethics and Science, or CORES. We are excited to bring you a rich and stimulating program of events touching on subjects as diverse as the origin of the universe and humane economics. This opening session is to provide you, our audience, an overview of this remarkable event. But before we get into the specifics, it's my great pleasure to call upon ASU's president, Michael M. Crow, to provide his welcome to open our conference.
Hi, Michael Crow here, president of Arizona State University. I just want to welcome all of you to this conference on religion, ethics, and science. You're at an institution that doesn't believe that we have all the answers, that there's many answers to still be realized, and that it's going to be a part of a process where we take on all of the complexities of the three words, religion, ethics, and science together. We're bringing together great thought leaders talking about really, really important questions. The evolution of biological sciences, the unraveling of the instruction set for humans and for other organisms, the discovery of the origins of the first stars, the movements of all kinds of things, the notion of what is our responsibility to the planet, the ideas of sustainability, the notion and concept of religion and ethics as it relates to science, bringing all these things together. These are big, big issues because science is accelerating in terms of our understanding of nature, and therefore we have to now further evolve our ethical foundation from which we're going to make all of the decisions that we're going to be making relative to the use of that knowledge and the use of those insights. ASU is rich in intellectual diversity, rich in units. We've got the Beyond Initiative, the Jewish Studies Center, the School for Economic Thought. We've got the Center for Economic Liberty, the Study for Religion, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, all these things coming together and other things with a great faculty. I mean, it's just really a huge opportunity. I want to ask you to push your conversations, push them hard, continue to work together in all of this. I mean, this is an area where we need as much open, free, and unbelievably rigorous conversations as we can put together. So again, have a great conference and welcome. Thank you.
And thank you, President Crow, for your generous welcoming remarks and participation in tonight's program. To begin our overview, I'd first like to introduce one of the key visionaries behind this conference, Professor Barry Ritchie of ASU's Physics Department. Barry has a distinguished career in subatomic physics, but he is also being very interested in the constructive engagement of science and religion, and is an affiliated faculty member of ASU's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. So tell us, Barry, what are you hoping to achieve by this conference?
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you to our audience for joining us in this event. I have perhaps several goals for this conference, but I think the most important goal I have is to showcase a model of discussion that seems to be quite rare of late, a respectful, informed discussion among people who passionately hold differing views on important subjects. As our September 2020 CORES event with the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks highlighted, the first step to restoring civility in our polarized society is not attempting to convert others directly to our own opinion, but rather to first humbly listen and seek to understand those viewpoints that are different from ours. Rabbi Sacks spoke of how a civil society was first and foremost a moral achievement. The truth is that we will never have unanimous agreement on many of the contested points that we're going to hear about in this series of conversations. So we must seek to better understand each other and to learn again what it means to live amicably with our differences.
And the meeting is being sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation.
Yes, the CORES project is funded through a subcontract with the Arizona Center of Christian Studies with a grant proposed by Ben Sanders, the director of that center, and myself. And of course, like any event like this, the opinions expressed at the conference are the speaker's own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the sponsors.
And Barry, can you say something about your own background? How did you become involved in the intersection of science and religion?
Well, thank you for asking. And you know, it's a personal look that I guess I should speak about. First, I'm a child of the space age. I was blessed to live at one of the most exciting times in human history, the time when humanity took its first steps off this planet. John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, was my hero. I even wrote to him when I was a boy. My fascination with the space program led to a lifelong fascination with learning more about how our universe works. And that led me to pursue a PhD in physics in college. Secondly, I'm also a child of the church, and I was blessed to be raised in a church-centered family. That foundation of faith led me to a lifelong desire to better understand and know God. Now, there's an incident that happened to me when I was a high school student that I think speaks to this question about how I wound up here. I attended a consolidated high school located in a rural area of the county in North Carolina in which I grew up. All sophomore students were required to take a one-semester sociology course. And within that course was a unit on religion. I remember so clearly that the religion section of the textbook began with the definition of religion as man's study of the forces that control the universe. Now, while I might quibble with that definition today, I was struck at that time by that definition. Man's study of the forces of nature. I was struck by that definition because I thought that was the definition of physics. This realization that the two great motivations of my life shared a common theme led me to explore how they intertwined and reinforced the work I do. For me, both science and religion are sincere efforts to understand the life with which I have been blessed, or as put by Johannes Kepler, who is another Lutheran scientist, by the way, science and faith both are attempts to think God's thoughts after him.
Now, the media often presents science and religion as being at loggerheads, but you believe there is a middle ground that can accommodate a fruitful dialogue. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Pauline. Since I personally see physics as simply one of the ways that God works in the world, I don't see physics as opposing faith, nor have I ever sought any God of the gaps or anything like that. Since I see both science and religion as sincere efforts to understand the universe and our purpose in it, I have never accepted the idea that at their foundations, science and religion are in conflict.
Well, let's give the audience an overview of the conversation we'll be having in a few minutes from now.
Certainly. Tonight's session, to begin in only a few minutes, opens our conference by pondering the connections and relationships between science, wisdom, and the common good. For the past several centuries, science has come to be seen as the engine of progress, the main source of solutions to social problems, and even the sole arbiter of truth. Now, science certainly provides knowledge about the world, but most of us feel that wisdom is broader in scope. We understand wisdom as addressing the meaning of human life as well, and pondering how humans relate to the natural world, to other humans, and to the ultimate source of meaning, God by whatever name. How should we understand the interactions and intersections between science and other forms of knowledge and the traditions of wisdom? How can those understandings inform the relationships between religious, scientific, and democratic communities. Pauline, you will be introducing our panelists shortly and moderating that discussion. I'm sure we're going to hear some very thoughtful and probably some very thought-provoking responses to these questions. But I would also add for the members of the audience to say that we are inviting you to submit questions using the question and answer function in Zoom. Those questions will be collected and transferred over to the panel of conversants for our conversation tonight for their response at the end of the conversation. Now, I have to apologize in advance that we are not going to be able to answer every question in the limited time we'll have. But I am sure you will find all the questions posed to be very, very interesting.
So that will be the upcoming session in a few minutes. But we've got a full program tomorrow as well. So let's tell our audience what's on tap for tomorrow.
Sure thing. We'll have a full program indeed, Pauline. We'll be hosting 4 more conversations tomorrow, as well as a full menu of lunch and learn sessions, where audience members can choose from 7 different lunchtime talks. Now, we'll start things off tomorrow at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. For our viewers at other spots on the globe, please note that Mountain Standard Time is 7 hours earlier than UTC. Our first conversation will explore how the values and expectations of religion, ethics, and economic science intersect in a discussion entitled Toward a Humane Economy. A common assumption about the marketplace is that we as individuals are interested only in our own desires and not in the needs and wants of others. Now, personal prosperity is not necessarily bad, but should we restrain our pursuit of the material good life for ourselves if we also want to seek the common good? How do we reconcile the assumptions of economics as one of the most successful of the social sciences with the ethical demands that emerge from religious beliefs held by many, if not most, of those in society? ASU Professor Ross Emmett will lead that conversation, and he'll be joined with participants Professor Mary Hirschfeld of Villanova University, Professor Russ Roberts of Stanford University and Shalem College, and Professor and Nobel laureate Vernon Smith of Chapman University.
And moving on from this session on economics and the humane society, we will turn to the challenges of making science and technology more inclusive of minority voices and participation. In a session moderated by ASU Professor Vanessa Ruiz, Elaine Howard Eklund from Rice University will present her findings based on the most comprehensive international study ever undertaken of scientists' attitude about religion, gender, and ethics. And joining her in conversation will be ASU Professors Patricia Rankin, newly appointed as chair of the Department of Physics, and Dr. Tara Nkrumah of the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. Together, they'll be exploring the many dimensions involved with making science and technology more inclusive.
After that discussion, we invite our audience to pick from our fascinating menu of lunch and learn choices. These short talks include topics in art, astronomy, biology, cosmology, medicine, psychology, sustainability, and religion. So take a look at the CORES program, pick the lunch and learn topic you are most interested in, and then tune in for a fascinating discussion.
And I've actually got a lunch and learn session as well. Hope you tune in for that. And following the lunch and learn sessions, we will turn to a conversation provocatively titled, "What does God actually do?" The word God means very different things to different people, but age-old theological debates, such as whether God is inside or outside of time, and whether divine intervention implies a flawed universe, take on a new perspective in light of modern science. In the age of Big Bang cosmology, laboratory experiments to create life, and searches for ET and extraterrestrial intelligence, the issue of God's action in the world is thrown into sharp relief. And this leads to the question, If science can explain the universe, is there anything left for God to do? Well, Professors Sarah Copley from Cambridge University, George Ellis from the University of Cape Town, and Keith Ward of Oxford University will be in conversation with ASU's Paul Davies, and I will have the pleasure of moderating that discussion.
Our last conversation for this conference will look at the intersection of theology, technology, and a post-secular world. Science and technology, so much a part of our lives, often are portrayed as purely secular pursuits. But the reality is that the boundaries between science and religion, between the secular and the sacred, are neither clearly defined or truly rigid. Yet the idea that science and technology are not only secular, but also secularizing continues to shape public life. This conversation will ask what these transformations mean for the study of religion and the future of secularism. Our speakers will include Professor Michael Burdett of the University of Nottingham and ASU professors Gaiman Bennett, Ben Hurlbut, and Hava Tirosh-Samuelson. The discussion will be moderated by ASU professor John Carlson.
So, as you can see, the meeting will cover some pretty profound topics about the nature and meaning of existence, how to make morally defensible choices, and how to accept the discoveries of modern science without abandoning religious faith. So it's appropriate to address a few remarks to the students in our audience, those who are just starting out to chart their own intellectual journey. Barry.
Students, my hope for you for this conference and my goals for you in this conference are the same as those I mentioned earlier. I of course want you to be informed and excited about the topics to be presented. Maybe your own opinions might change as a result of something you hear. But foremost, I want you also to see how these remarkable scholars who are incredibly passionate about their fields can discuss and dialogue and respectfully disagree with each other. You will see that they are not seeking primarily to convert each other, but instead striving to do their best to understand the opinions that differ from their own while trying to, as clearly as possible, portray their own opinions. Now, I urge you, both students, but also once again, members of the audience that aren't students, to remember that you can submit questions using the question and answer function in Zoom. Again, we will not be able to answer every question in the limited time we have, but we will certainly get to pose some of them, and I'm sure you will find all of them interesting.
Barry, tell us about the future of CORES. Will there be more events like this?
Absolutely, absolutely. We will have more events like this. Now, it's really very difficult to predict how things will look a year from now while we are still in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. Our plans, nonetheless, are to host another CORES event next year, but this time in person, if you can still imagine such a thing as an in-person meeting. We hope to host CORES 2022 in person on the campus of Arizona State University. Tentatively, we are looking at February 11th and 12th of 2022. Now, as long as we're talking about future events, if you members of the audience would like to financially support such conversations, please know that you may donate to the CORES project at the Center for Study of Religion and Conflict website.
Well, Barry, that's a great place to stop. And you, the audience, can get settled with a cup of tea or whatever is your favorite beverage and get ready for our first panel conversation. And that's going to be on science, wisdom, and the common good. And that's coming up at 7:30. So I've been talking to Professor Barry Ritchie of ASU's physics department. And in pre-COVID days, I'd ask you to give Barry a round of applause, but we'll just have to settle for virtual applause. It has certainly been my great pleasure talking to you, Barry, and I greatly look forward to the sessions to follow. Thank you so much for your thoughts, Barry.
Certainly, it's been my pleasure.
for this evening's conversation. I'm going to start that again because I think I was unmuted there. Let's try. So welcome everyone, and welcome to this session on science, wisdom, and the common good. Now I'm delighted to briefly introduce the participants in this evening's conversation. Our special guests tonight are Father Kevin FitzGerald. Father FitzGerald works at Creighton University, which is a Jesuit university in Nebraska, where he is chair of the Department of Medical Humanities in the School of Medicine. His research focuses on the use of reflection in medical education, on investigating abnormal gene expression in cancer, and on ethical issues in biomedical research and medical genomics. And also Rabbi Elliot Dorff, rector and distinguished service professor of philosophy at the American Jewish University. He has served on several federal and state commissions on issues in healthcare. He is the chair of the conservative movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. One of his many books is Matters of Life and Death, a Jewish approach to modern medical ethics. And they're going to be in discussion with ASU professors, Hava Tirosh-Samuelson, who is Regents Professor of History, the Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. She is an intellectual historian and writes on Jewish philosophy and mysticism, religion, science and technology, and religion and ecology. Paul Carrese is a professor of political philosophy and American political thought, and the founding director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. And finally, Ben Hurlbut, who is an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences. He trained in science and technology studies, and his research focuses on the relationship between governance of science and technology, religious and moral pluralism, and public reason. And I'm about to hand over now to Ben, who's going to start the discussion, but I'll be back towards the end of the session to put your questions to our special guests. Ben.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Father FitzGerald and Rabbi Dorff, let me start by saying it's such a pleasure to be here with you. Wonderful to see you. And I'm afraid that the topic of this session is timely given our circumstances. And so I'm going to begin with a particularly timely question. And it's this. So we, of course, are living through an unprecedented public health emergency, or at least unprecedented within our lifespans. And it has, of course, foregrounded significant vulnerabilities in public health, but I think also in tensions between protecting the health of people's bodies and other dimensions of well-being, personal, social, political, but also spiritual. And one of the areas of tension that has emerged is between the imperative to protect public health, but also the protection of these other dimensions of lives, including religion. So religious practice, but also other dimensions like religious practices of care, dying, death, mourning, and other crucial rituals. So it's foregrounded that tension and raised corollary questions about how a society should make decisions about the relative importance of protecting bodies versus, you might say, serving souls in some sense. And also the sort of questions about what's at stake in that question. So I want to ask a very broad question that sort of comes out of these tensions. And that is, as we come out of this pandemic, as hopefully we will begin to do or have begun to do, what questions do you think we need to ask as a society about how we've contended with these dimensions of life in the context of a public health emergency that reach beyond bare biological health, particularly into religious and spiritual dimensions of life? Maybe on this one, we'll begin with Father FitzGerald.
Thank you so much, Professor Hurlbut. And again, let me say how great it is to be with all of you to have this discussion, which I agree is both timely and extremely necessary. Now, I picked up on the fact that you did use the word tension several times. And so let me start with that in terms of saying one of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves as we go forward. And I would argue, I hope we go truly forward. I think we cannot go back. I think what the pandemic has revealed to us shows us that we need to go ahead to hopefully what we will create is a better world. And that brings me to that word tension. Are the tensions that we are experiencing going to be for us creative tensions, or are they going to be destructive tensions? And I think one of the other things the pandemic has revealed for us is that we are very much riddled in our societies with many more destructive tensions, I think, than we were aware of before. And I think one of the things we have to do to go forward is acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that there are these deep disagreements that are going to force us to look hard at the way we have done things, hopefully in a way that allows us to move forward more constructively. Constructively in a way that is going to both address these issues, but also allow us to be constructive in how we respond. And so, you know, you mentioned the fact that people have recognized, and we have come to understand, that people have a need for community. They have a need for their religious community, for the religious practices. All that is true. But we've also recognized that communities have needs for safety, needs for health, needs for way to care for one another. And that's one of those tensions that I hope we can make creative in terms of perhaps even adapting or refocusing our rituals so that we now recognize that, yes, it is to address my needs, but also in the process needs to be a ritual that connects me with others in a way that helps me address their needs. And so one of the things I'm really interested in seeing as we go forward is, can we both be humble enough to acknowledge that we have not perhaps done as well as we had hoped leading up to this tragic crisis, but also that we may need to have to look at things a little more differently, perhaps going back to our essential, most fundamental values, love of God and love of neighbor, to help us see how we can make these tensions constructive and find a way forward that'll truly be beneficial for all.
Rabbi Dorff.
Well, as I was introduced, I am chair of the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. I should mention that the conservative movement is the middle movement in Judaism, with Orthodox on our right and Reform on our left. And as this pandemic took hold, we were bombarded with questions by rabbis and lay people about everything. Can you have a minyan, for example? A minyan is a quorum of 10 adult Jews that you need for certain parts of the service. Can you have a minyan on Zoom or on live stream? And if you can't, then what do you do in terms of the services? And if you can you have a minyan for everything or only for certain parts of the service? What do you do with life cycle events? What happens if a baby is born and we have the usual rituals for babies being born? Let's say a boy needs to be circumcised according to Jewish law on the 8th day after his birth. Are only the parents there and the person, the Moel, the person who circumcises the boy, and everybody else is on Zoom? Or can you do even that? Should you postpone the whole thing until after the pandemic is over? Those kinds of questions. What about a bar mitzvah on Zoom? Can it be in certain places in somebody's backyard with social distancing and everybody else is on Zoom? Or does the whole thing have to be on Zoom? Marriages, what do you do with that? And what do you do with funerals? People do die, after all, under these circumstances, and they need to be buried. And so under what circumstances do you do that? Especially because you need a minyan for certain parts of these services, right? And then all kinds of questions about the bioethics of all of this. Triage issues. What does the Jewish tradition say about who gets a ventilator? That's what we were talking about in March. Now it's a question of who gets the vaccine. What are the issues in terms of of masks. Does the Jewish tradition require that you wear mask and social distance? Answer, yes, yes, yes. Does the tradition require that you get a vaccine when it's available to you and when you're eligible? Answer, yes, yes, yes. And so, I mean, but what you need to do in order to understand this is that the way that the tradition works is that we try to take from the precedents of our tradition and from the values of our tradition and apply them to our own time. Another part of this that I think, and by the way, one of the, as Father FitzGerald said, one of the real issues that's going to happen after this is all over is what parts of what we're doing now are going to continue on afterward. One of the, if we didn't have Zoom now, by the way, we would really be in trouble, right? I mean, we would not be able to have this conversation. We wouldn't be able to have this conference, right? But the one very small, the pandemic is terrible. The virus is terrible. All right, let's just say that straight out. But one of the sort of silver linings is that rabbis have found that many more people attend classes now than did when we had to come together, right? Because you just stay at home and you don't have to fight the freeway and the traffic on the freeway and all of that, right? On the other hand, though, you can't sing together on Zoom. You can't be with your friends together in the same way on Zoom. So when we get back together, we clearly are going to want to be together for services and for all these life cycle events and the like, right? But on the other hand, people have learned how to cruise the internet for services in other synagogues across the country. So will they still be members of their own synagogue and pay dues and things like that, right? I mean, all of those things are really very much up in the air, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens after that. This is all over. One other thing that I think is really important here is that in contrast to the Western philosophical tradition, going back to Plato, which made a sharp distinction between the mind and the body, leading to what's called the mind-body problem in Western thought. In other words, if the mind and the body are so separate, then what makes them connected? In the Jewish tradition, from the very beginning, the Jewish tradition saw us as being an integrated whole. Our mind, our body, our emotions, our will, our connections to other people, all of that is part of who we are. And that has really come to be understood, to be very important in this time. I'm a past president of Jewish Family Service, and we've seen, unfortunately, a real uptick in depression, in family violence, and frankly, even in suicide. And so what we need to recognize is that the mental and emotional parts of our existence are as much a part of who we are as the physical parts are. And we can't reach out and touch somebody, but you really do need to reach out and make connections with other people. Because back to Genesis chapter 2, it's not good for a person to be alone. Or to quote another ancient Jewish source, people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. That's not an ancient Jewish source, you understand that. Okay, but you get the point, right? That what we have figured out here now, if we haven't known before, is that we have real social needs, and those need to be accommodated.
Well, amen to that. I want to shift gears just a little bit since I only get you guys for a little while, into a quite different domain. But I think that there's a sense in which, because we have been so acutely focused on the circumstances, on present circumstances, and particular dimensions of life and health, there are other larger issues looming that have kind of gone on the back burner, but are of great significance, and that you both have thought about quite a bit. So these are, broadly speaking, developments in the life sciences that touch upon sort of fundamental dimensions of human life. And one area, emergent area, is the capacity to genetically engineer, to edit the human genome, including potentially making heritable changes to the human genome. So what I want to do is ask you a question about the role and the forms of wisdom that religious traditions bring to questions about these sorts of technological possibilities. 4 decades ago, when a group of people sought to catalyze a discussion about precisely this issue. It was a group of religious organizations that called for attention to technological possibility of human genetic engineering and its meaning for, this is from what they wrote, quote, the fundamental nature of human life and the dignity and worth of the individual human being. So I want to ask, what contributions or insights do you see each of your religious traditions making to that dialogue? It need not be an exhaustive list, of course. But then equally importantly, what role do you see for religious traditions in society's processes for making sense of the challenges posed by these technologies? And since we've just been speaking about community and its transformation and maybe attenuation, in particular, the relationships between religious communities, scientific communities, and democratic communities around these fundamentally human challenges. I'll pass it back to you, Rabbi Dorff, to start us off on this one.
Okay, I actually co-edited a book called Jews and Genes, the genetic future in contemporary Jewish life, and it's an anthology of a number of Jews who disagree with each other. What else is new? It's just the nature of my people and my tradition. So what I'm about to tell you is my position, not necessarily any other Jew's position. Okay. I mean, one of the things, on the one hand, some of the issues that we're talking about in terms of actually genetic intervention, there are issues in terms of genetic testing, and there are issues in terms of genetic identity. Both of those are both of those pieces of the genetic future have multiple pieces in it. But I think that the thing that's probably most controversial is genetic interventions. If we use CRISPR-9 or some other technique to change the genome, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And if you're going to do it, under what circumstances would you do it? I have my wife and I have 4 children. My youngest is a physician, and when he and his wife were planning on having children, they were tested for the Ashkenazic Jewish diseases. This is 17, 18 years ago, and they came out with a clean bill of health. So they had their first child, and it turned out that he has Fragile X syndrome, which was not part of the genetic Ashkenazi Jewish panel, at least at the time. I mean, now when Jews are tested for genetic diseases, or anybody else for that matter, first of all, you don't have to give blood. It'd be a swab of saliva, and something like 200 different diseases are tested at the same time. But he has Fragile X, and when puberty came, it's multiple deficits as a result of that. When puberty came, the hormones did what they did, and he had no clue as to what was going on, and he became violent. So he had to be institutionalized. So there's a piece of me that thinks that if we're talking about lethal genetic diseases like Tay-Sachs or familial dysautonomia, or if we're talking about very debilitating genetic diseases like Fragile X, if I could engineer them out of the genome, I would want to do that. The other side of me, though, as a Jew, is that, and as an American, is that eugenics has played a terrible role in our history, right? I mean, it was we Americans who introduced eugenics in a big way in the early 1900s. Nobody less than Oliver Wendell Holmes, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in the Supreme Court decision in the 1920s, said 3 generations of idiots is enough, and he allowed for the sterilization of people who were less than, well, idiots is a bad term, but that's what they were talking about, right? The people who had less than normal intelligence. And the Nazis really learned eugenics from us. And then they applied it to Jews and to gays and lesbians and to all kinds of other people, right? So I'm really, really scared, frankly, of eugenics. And so while I would want to engineer out lethal or really debilitating diseases, I'm really afraid of where does that boundary stop, and where does eugenics, that is, means literally, generating for good, generating good people. Well, what is the definition of good people? If you were to do this, would you engineer out deaf people or blind people, right? Clearly, you know, if you were to have children, you would prefer that your children be both sighted and hearing, right? But if you rule out simply through this process deaf people and blind people, what are you saying? Are you saying that that's not a full human being? Are you going to get rid of Beethoven? Are you going to, or Bach? I forget, one of them was blind. I forget which. And and what about all the people that have contributed immensely to human society with various kinds of disabilities, right? You don't want to, at least I don't want to do that. And I think that every one of these people is created in the image of God and deserves to live and to flourish as much as we possibly can. It's really very hard to draw these lines if you're going to draw them at all. And I think some people would not want to draw them at all because of these dangers, right? These dangers of getting into eugenics once we try to change the human genome altogether. But again, the Jewish tradition is really very much interested in medicine. There's been a virtual love affair between Jews and medicine for about 2,000 years, both on the practical end and also on the research end. And so there's a piece of me that would want to engineer out lethal or really debilitating diseases, but at the same time, not change the human genome for anything else.
Father Kevin.
So that's great. And I very much appreciate what Rabbi Dorff just said, because I think he very concretely raised again that idea of that creative tension there of, on the one hand, reverencing and caring for each human being as they are, as they come to us. And at the same time, trying to do everything we can to help that individual flourish. And it's not always easy to find that balance in particular. You mentioned that you were shifting gears dramatically here with your questions, but actually, considering what's going on right now with COVID, we're going to discover the fact that there are people out there who got the virus and were barely impacted, right? And then there are other families where I think the family they discovered in Belgium, where they discovered they had a genetic difference in that family, which had never manifested itself before in any way that any clinician had ever encountered, except now with COVID, the vast majority of the family died because it just turns out that their genetic difference made them particularly susceptible to this virus. So that, I think, is going to be where this genome editing and genetic engineering technology is going to tempt us. Let's somehow manipulate ourselves so that we're impervious to everything. And of course, if we're impervious to everything, we'll probably be impervious to being human too, because to be human is to be limited, in a sense, to suffer at times, not suffer needlessly, but suffer because we care for one another, suffer because we don't like to see others suffer. So that, I think, is going to help frame for us a way to go forward in a manner that Rabbi Dorff was mentioning. How can we both reverence and love each human individual as they come to us without trying to say, this one's good enough and this one isn't? And yet at the same time, understand how we might help that individual flourish, be all that that individual can be, including their limitations. So, and that's going to be a difficult balance to strike. But I think in our endeavor to do that, we may not use the technology or even perfect the technology as well as we could, but we may become much better at using technology to care for each other. And so if I have to choose between one of those two goals, I'm going to opt for the latter, because the goal of healthcare, after all, is to care, not just to technologically intervene.
Thank you. So we could take up the entire hour with this line of conversation, of course, but I'm afraid I have to now hand the baton off to Hava, who will ask you still more difficult questions.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Father FitzGerald and Rabbi Dorff. We're going to switch a little bit from the focus on the challenges of biotechnology to more philosophical or philosophically oriented kind of question, or philosophical and theological. So I'll start with a with a reference to a verse that we all know from the book of Job. Job 28:12 asks us rhetorically, but where can wisdom be found, and where is the source of understanding? So I would like us to focus on those two words and ask you, how do you answer Job's mysterious question? Does science provide us with wisdom and understanding? And if so, why do we need religion? And if not, how can science complement religion? What is the relationship between them, which is really the focus of this conversation? And particularly to kind of focus the last question, what is the relationship between scientific knowledge and religious knowledge? And if this is not enough, can we add the word truth to the conversation? And how does truth fit into this reflection on wisdom? So Elliot, Rabbi Dorff, I'm going to start with you. Could you help us a little bit here?
Okay, the 3 times a day in the services that traditional Jews say, we ask God to grant us Deah, Binah, V'Haskel. Deah is factual knowledge. Binah, Bet Yod Nun means between. It's analytic knowledge, the ability to distinguish one thing from another. You know, back to Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong, right? That's analytic knowledge. And then Haskel, or Seichel, which is wisdom. Wisdom is knowledge gained through experience. And the Bible is very often called Chachma, right? In that sense, the Chacham is is knowledge gained by experience. And you know, the old story that, you know, somebody goes to the wise person and says, "How did you gain wisdom?" Through experience. How did you gain experience? Good choices. How did you get to make good choices? Bad choices. Okay. So I mean, what happens is that if you're talking about wisdom, you're talking about savoir-faire. You're talking about street smarts, if you will. You're talking about how you learn how to live your life in a way that is going to enable you to thrive, enable you to have good relationships with other people, enable you to help others, and to learn how to do that. That's very different from factual knowledge, which would make you good at Jeopardy, for example, or make you good at science. And it's different also from analytic ability, right? Your ability to take whatever you know and to be able to distinguish certain things from others and analogize other things from others. So, I mean, I think these are very different kinds of knowledge. I'm very interested in science. Both Father FitzGerald and I were involved in a commission for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We're both really interested in this, and we're both very, very much interested in our religious commitments, right? One of the ways in which I would understand this is that, just one of the ways, is that religion provides perspective on life, right? The various religions of the world understand who we are as human beings, and as members of communities, and what kind of a person and what kind of a community should I strive to be, right? Understand those things in very different ways. The various religions of the world understand those things in different ways, and the very secular philosophies of the world, Western liberalism, Marxism, existentialism, right? They also understand mysticism. They understand who we are and who we ought to be in very different ways. And those kinds of questions are not really scientific questions. Those are questions of perspective. And religions give you those kinds of perspectives as to who you are and who you ought to be. And so, I mean, I think that now science plays an important role for me as a religious Jew in trying to navigate that, right? So, I mean, if I find out, for example, well, we're only into this a little while and you're going to hear my Achilles heel. If I find out that eating a half a gallon of ice cream every night of the week And if I'm doing it already, it might as well be mint chocolate chip or cherry Garcia. That stuff is so good. Anyway, if I find out scientifically that I'm going to gain 500 pounds in no time, right? If I do that, that's an important fact that I should take into consideration in order for me to fulfill my duty in the Jewish tradition to God to take care of my body, right? So scientific facts are going to be important in terms of how I fulfill my religious obligations, both to God and to my fellow human beings, right? And scientific facts are also going to be important in terms of my religious understanding of life. The awesomeness of creation is if anything, highlighted by anything that I would learn, that I have learned in physics, and I actually took a course in physics in college, and what I've learned from all kinds of doctors in regard to the workings of the body. After it's all said again, 3 times a day in the Jewish liturgy, we thank God for your miracles that are with us each day. Now, that's not a miracle in the sense of an interruption in the order of nature. That's because it's miracles that are with us each day. It's the miracle of the fact that we exist and that our bodies function and that we're able to think and that we're able to interact with people. I mean, all of those kinds of things, right? And the more that I learn about those, the more I'm appreciative of those. And I think the ultimate religious viewpoint is one of awe and of gratitude. So I think that's what religion really contributes to me. On the other hand, science makes those attitudes all the more founded and all the more grounded and all the more amazing.
Great. And Father FitzGerald, could you reflect on the same set of questions from the perspective of your tradition?
Certainly. And I'm going to start by doing what all good Christians do and borrow heavily from the Jewish tradition. So I'll steal all of Rabbi Dorff's stuff. So absolutely. I think at the end, when he was saying, what religion brings and what science brings, that is the difference, and that is the complementarity. So if I need to know what it is exactly I'm encountering and how it functions, then I'm going to be asking scientific questions. I want to know the quantitative aspects of whatever this is I'm encountering. But if I ask myself, why should I care? Science can't answer that question. And I ask anyone who's watching this with us and joining us this evening, go to a scientist and ask them about their work. And I tell you, they will be very excited to tell you at length and in depth. But they interrupt them at one point and say, but why should I care? And watch the shift away from the quantitative to, can't you see the beauty in this? Can't you see the potential for healing? Can't you, and it all moves into that larger realm, which is not science, but it is that exploration that we have of what brings meaning into our lives. And this is, of course, the area of religion. This is where religion operates, right? Encountering the transcendental, reaching out for that which is beyond us. So that, I think, is an easy way to just continually look at how these two are different. And where wisdom is often rather easy to find in those religious traditions. I mean, again, there's a wonderful thing that we Christians were able to bring on from the Jewish tradition was also wisdom literature in the Bible. And one of the most amazing things that you can see over and over again in that literature, in addition to what Rabbi Dorff said, certainly awe and gratitude, but also humility.
Yeah.
Recognizing that when we encounter that reality that we are in, we realize, whoa, just how tiny a part of that we are, and yet at the same time loved by the creator of all of that. Now, how do we balance that off? And again, this is not just in the Judeo-Christian tradition. You can go to the Upanishads and the Vedas. In Hinduism, you can go to Confucianism and look for the fabric of the creation of a good society and all that. And it's always there, that issue of recognizing our place, and in doing that, becoming humble and acknowledging that we don't have the answers. And so when you say, where is truth? we can recognize the fact that there is truth. I think we can apprehend that, but to comprehend truth, we can only begin to start to approach. And there again, I think we recognize our neediness and the gratitude that we have that comes from realizing that that creator, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Islamic tradition, cares so much for us that that creator is willing to share with us more than we could ever find on our own.
So that would be a good segue to the next question. We don't have a lot of time for it, but I do want to pose it in the following way. We are all perplexed today. In the 12th century, Maimonides wrote The God of the Perplexed, helping the Jews of his day to overcome the perplexity. But how would you, and I'll start with Father FitzGerald, how would you answer the perplexity of the contemporary person who really seems to be feeling that the problems are too deep or too complicated, and we don't know where to go? Or it seems that the conflict between religion and science is so insoluble, so we are kind of stuck in that necessary conflict. So what would be your response to the contemporary perplexed person?
And, you know, my response would be to, first of all, ask, and I agree with you completely. We are in the age of data. You know, everybody's talking about big data. And of course, data is not knowledge. Data is not understanding. Data is not wisdom. It's just data. It's what you do with it that allows you to do anything. And I think people become overwhelmed by the data. But I would like to ask, do you think you're the first in human history to be overwhelmed by something that you are experiencing? Imagine the first humans that recognized a solar eclipse for something that was definitely out of the ordinary and was not something they could predict at that time. Anything that came along for them that was new was something they had to then say, all right, how do we put this into our growing, evolving, constantly changing understanding, hopefully improving understanding and nascent wisdom of our reality. So for those who get sort of bogged down in the technicalities of these sorts of things, I always turn to good old epistemology. I mean, the study of how we know what we know. And I like to try to remind scientists, it's much more than just cognitive science. It's more than doing an fMRI on someone's blood flow in the brain when they're thinking about a particular, you know, concept that you've given to them, right? That certainly that information and that data can be helpful in terms of the functioning of the brain, but it doesn't grasp for us the meaning of that concept that we are considering at that time and what that meaning has for us in terms of putting that particular event into context with the events of our lives and the events of the lives of the people we love, our family, our friends, and our communities. So for me, I think we can get back to as technical as you want, working our way through how we know what we know, but at the same time, constantly being aware of the worldviews we already have and how, as we learn, those things are evolving. And I guess one last thing I would do is I don't exactly embrace Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria in saying that science and religion never overlap. I think they do. I think there are areas where that happens. They may not be broad and extensive, but they do find ways that occurs. And for me, the places where that has occurred are the places where science sort of evanesces into something more. So theoretical physicists, when they're talking about the Big Bang, right? Or if they are talking about the end of the universe, what's that going to look like? You know, what was there before 10 to the minus 32nd seconds, right? Well, we don't know. We can't get there. So where do we go? What kind of questions do we ask? When we ask ourselves, how did life begin on Earth, right? what do we mean by life? What are we talking about? How do we know life? What does that mean for us to even ask that question? So that's when, you get, I would argue, some of that overlap. But in any case, all of that just leads us, again, on that path toward truth, that truth we're trying to not only embrace intellectually, but in a much more existential sort of way in our lives.
Very nice, thank you. And Rabbi Dorff, you can be the guide of the perplexed for a few minutes to give us a way to the rest of the 21st century.
Okay. Well, that's a tall order, Hava.
Tall order, yes, indeed.
I mean, I think it's important to understand why are we perplexed, and I think in part it's because we know more now than people did at the time of Maimonides or Aquinas. Remember, both of them wrote before the printing press, and so consequently, the fact that whatever the percentage is, 95% of Americans are literate, are able to read, and that we have not only books now, but we've got ebooks and everything else, right? And there's Dr. Google that will answer any question you want at any moment, right? The fact that we have all of that data and then all of that knowledge leads to more questions. I mean, it's in some ways it's really good that we're perplexed, because it should, if we are attending to this, it should reinforce the humility that Father FitzGerald was talking about before, right? It should give us a sense that we are not omniscient. We never were, right? I remind you that for most of human history, everybody, including the most scientifically adept, thought that the world was flat, right? For most of human history, that was scientific knowledge, right? So the fact that we are perplexed, and which means that we're asking questions, and that we're not satisfied with whatever the current state of whatever is, right? And that we're willing to try new things. I think that that's really, really critical. The Brentwood Presbyterian Church here had a series for their adult education on the religions of the world. So on a Sunday morning from 10 to 11, I had to do Judaism 101, right? And so one of the things I said was that before we get into the substance of the Jewish tradition, you need to know its mode. Its mode is very argumentative, right? I mean, nothing taken for granted, right? So a man came up to me afterward and he said, now I understand something. I said, what do you understand? He was an aeronautical engineer at TRW at the time, right? And he said, he's in late 50s, so he's been doing this for some 40 some years. He said, in all of my time there, whenever I suggested that we do something differently, I would get slammed down, except when I had a Jewish boss, right? Because what's at the heart of the Jewish tradition is questioning. I mean, Abraham questions God. Remember at Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So the judge of all the earth not do justice. That starts our tradition. Moses questions God at Mount Sinai and after the spy event, right? In Numbers 13 and 14. This is a tradition that loves being perplexed and loves asking questions and loves challenging things. And I think that gives us a way into knowledge, and it gives us a way into humility at the same time.
Thank you. And now I will ask Professor Carrese to propose his questions, which will focus more on political aspects or social aspects of our conundrum. Professor Carrese, please.
Thank you so much, Hava. It's a pleasure, but also a privilege for me to be in this conversation with all of you. And I hope after the plague is over, we can perhaps gather all together again, share some of the fruit of the vine. And the rabbi and the father could tell us their favorite, a rabbi, a priest, and an atheist walk into a bar jokes and talk about bioethics. I think that would be, but I have been assigned the task of asking some difficult political common good oriented questions. They echo some questions you've already had from Ben and from Hava about religion in a liberal democracy.
You see these offices.
Yeah, I love them. I love them. Men and women of books.
Sorry about that. How religion can contribute to understanding about these difficult issues. So more particularly, on this theme of the common good. How would each of you respond to concerns that a religious perspective per se can't really contribute to a common or consensus view to seeking the common good regarding these difficult questions, given that in the advanced liberal democracies today, so many people are not religious in any traditional sense? And why don't we continue the old covenant, new covenant order so that Father FitzGerald can keep borrowing from Rabbi Dorff.
You want me to start? Okay.
Yes, please do.
Well, I mean, I think that Father FitzGerald was talking about epistemology. How do you come to know anything? And how do you come to wise public policy? In the Jewish tradition and in the American tradition, starting with the First Amendment, if nothing else, right? The idea was that, is that you get everybody together from whatever perspective they have, and you let them, argue it out, right? That was the whole idea of the First Amendment, was that you have freedom of or from religion. You don't have to be religious at all. And Jefferson himself, most of the founding fathers were deists, right? You don't have to have religion at all, but if you have one, you can have whatever one you want. But there's none that's going to be established as the religion of the United States. And so what you're going to have is, and by the way, I've been on 3 federal commissions and 1 state commission in California. And one of the great things about that is you get people from very different backgrounds, different religions, different secular backgrounds, whatever. And you get them together to talk about what the issue at hand is, right? And it's only in that kind of a way that your own position can be challenged, and it should be, by other people. And you can then try to figure out, well, we are a pluralistic country. How are we going to come to a policy that's going to reflect the knowledge and the wisdom of all of these various constituents, right? How can we go forward? I mean, and sometimes it's hard. I mean, one of the commissions I was on was the Surgeon General's Commission in the early 2000s to try to diminish the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. And we were given evidence of the fact that if you have abstinence-only education, that postpones first sexual intercourse by maybe a year. And then the young people don't know how to use birth control. And so you're more likely to get unwanted pregnancies, right? But there was a woman there who was a pediatrician and who was an evangelical Christian. And despite that evidence, wanted to say the United States should advocate abstinence-only education, right? I must say, we had a long conversation together. It was very respectful. And I was not able to convince her otherwise, right? Okay. And that was hard, because we had really good evidence of what happens when you have abstinence-only education, right? And I could not budge her. So, I mean, when you get involved in these conversations, you've got to be prepared for that, right? You also have to be prepared for the fact that people will say things that are the exact opposite of what you believe. And then you have to, I think Jefferson et al. Were completely right. The way that you get to wise public policy is you get people who disagree with each other at the same table and let them figure out what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these arguments, right? That requires patience. It requires mutual respect. It requires a sense of a quest for knowledge and a quest for the common good, right? Not any of these things is easy for human beings, okay? But it is critical to what it means to be an American society, and I'm very proud of that.
Thank you. Father FitzGerald.
Sure, and great. Once again, I'll just keep building on what Rabbi Dorff has laid out. So I think that's absolutely true. And I would just then take one step back further and say, there are certain shared goals and values in the American experiment. That was part of the Founding Fathers' vision. So my question always is, well, okay, then what's the goal? If we're going to have this difficult conversation, is there a place where we can say we both can stand together and agree this is where we'd like to go. Now, that's not going to be for everything. I understand that completely. But is there a place where we would stand together and say, this is a good we would like to achieve? All right. How then do we go about doing that? And, you know, religious traditions, I mean, granted, the Jewish tradition could be absolutely the best at this because they're the most practiced. Obviously, in the Catholic tradition, we all just agree with everything the Pope says and just follow along with that. Wait, oh, I think there's lightning in the area, even though in Omaha. So
especially Jesuits in this day and age. Are very
exactly right. So yeah, all the religious traditions have processes and mechanisms that they have developed for dealing with contentious issues in such a way as that the community still remains together after you've had that discussion, right? And you may leave the discussion still not agreeing, but you're always reminded that there are more important things and bigger values at stake that you're all trying to foster. So my interesting thing is to say, if there is this thing as the American dream, as this democratic experiment, right? What are the fundamental values of that, and what are the goals of that we share? And it's been my experience when you get into discussions along those lines, one of two things happens. One is that you recognize the fact that you actually agree on much more than you thought you did. And then that means, you know, your points of contention are more focused, and there may be ways in which you can get more data or more information that will help you move through that. Or you discover that, in fact, the supposed shared common goals and values are not actually shared, that there are other things that are at work that take precedent for the other person, which then requires you to, again, take a step back and say, okay, now that we've recognized the fact that this isn't really common ground or the common good that we claim we're both after, is there one? And I think once you get to those points, then you may have to go all the way back to the fact that, you know, people want to live, people want to be cared for, people want to usually love and be loved, however they envision that. And you may have to go all the way back to that and just start there. And how can we build a society based on those very fundamental human needs? I think we thought we had gotten past that to a place maybe a little further along, but perhaps what our recent history has shown is maybe we need to go back and take some more fundamental looks at what we're calling this democratic liberal experiment and ask ourselves, is it what we think it is? And if it isn't, then we need to go and look at that much more deeply. And I think religious traditions have ways that we can look at that would help us do that.
Thank you. I want to follow up. And Rabbi Dorff already mentioned the institution or mechanism of commissions. So the Clinton administration and two other presidents, so 3 in a row, have established national bioethics commissions under various names. But the Trump administration did not continue what the Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama presidencies all had seen as a valuable forum to discuss and address major ethical questions or challenges arising from these new scientific technologies. So my specific question is, what do you think each of you would gain by having these 3 presidential commissions, again, established by presidents of different parties? Would you recommend that the Biden administration restore something like this entity? And if you do think it would be a good idea to bring back something like it, with what revisions or adaptations or ways to update it? And again, starting with Rabbi Dorff.
Well, I actually gave testimony to President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Commission on stem cell research and also on cloning. I mean, I think they did, you know, I mean, they had a specific day for different religious groups to give testimony on these issues. And I mean, I think they produce some very valuable materials. But I must say that the three commissions that I was on for the federal government were much more specifically honed, and I think as a result, we're much more pragmatically oriented. One was well, I was on Hillary Clinton's healthcare task force. May it rest in peace. But the idea was to try to create a healthcare policy for the United States. The Surgeon General is one that I mentioned, and then the last one that I was on was to review and revise the federal guidelines on research on human subjects. After Jesse Gelsinger, a young man, died at the University of Pennsylvania as a result of an medical experiment, and Ellen Roach at Johns Hopkins had died as well. And so, I mean, I think those kinds of commissions that are not just general bioethics commissions, but are given specific mandates to look at a given issue, I think those are more productive.
Father FitzGerald?
Okay, I'm going to do something radical here and move away from what Rabbi Dorff just said, and recognizing the fact that yeah, there have been some commissions, as he's mentioned, which have been focused on sort of engaging specific issues. I think that was the mandate specifically under the Obama administration for their bioethics commission. But I'm looking back, and I have to, you know, for transparency's sake, tell everybody I'm biased here because I was a mentee and a good friend of Dr. Edmund Pellegrino. And when he took over the Bush Bioethics Commission, I think he did something a little different than any other commission had done before, at least in the US. And that was to turn it into more of that think tank kind of approach that said, all right, we are going to address specific issues, but in doing that, we're going to look at the bigger issues that our discussion about this specific issue brings up. And then we're going to have those too. And then we're going to try to ask ourselves, can we get any traction on those bigger issues, at least to clarify them, so perhaps we can get some constructive movement forward in that regard. The reason I'm going to emphasize that and suggest that might be good for the Biden administration is because I think of our current situation and the numerous polarized segments of society that are out there right now. That would allow us to have a commission that could not only address certain specific issues that need to be looked at, but could also model how we might have constructive dialogue in the midst of very contentious issues. And the more we model that, I think, in this day and age, I think the better off we're all going to be.
Good point.
Well, I have just a couple minutes left in this segment, so just a brief response from each of you on this. A particular suggestion, if we did want to encourage some kind of national commission to bring together a range of viewpoints in a very fractured, polarized, intellectual, political landscape. Just a specific suggestion each of you might have about how to do that or who might be invited. Just briefly, Rabbi Dorff.
Well, I must say, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times about 5 years ago where they pointed out that among the students of Hollywood High School, there were 70 different native languages. We are a pluralistic society, and I glory in that. I think part of what makes me a proud American is that this country, more than any other country on the face of the earth ever, has tried to get people of very different backgrounds to live together, to work together, and to learn from each other. And that, I think, is really the heart of what it means to be an American. And it's also what enables us to go forward in ways that no other country can. Because if you're living and working with people who don't share all your views and who will challenge you, that's what's going to get you to move forward. So I would hope that that we would be able as Americans to really to do that, and to do that well, as we have done in the past, and do it even better in the future.
Father FitzGerald.
And I think a way that we might be able to concretely implement that would be to, first of all, mandate that the group we bring together is not a group that is going to get us any particular outcome that we want ahead of time. Right. But in fact is a group of people which is less likely to do that, because of the positions that they hold. And I also think in terms of the enormous heterogeneity that we are trying to represent, it would also be, it would be a good idea to try to look for individuals who represent a variety of groups in the things that they do in their own professional life, in their own faith life, in just who they are. And so look for diverse people and bring those diverse people with their diverse sets of talents and backgrounds and communities that they represent together to see what they can then engender in terms not only of outcomes of what their deliberations achieve, but also outcomes in terms of the methodologies that they may be able to develop in achieving those outcomes.
I'm going to have to stop you
Yes,
because
thank you.
this discussion has been absolutely fascinating, really stimulating and fun and lively. And we've got lots and lots of questions from the audience, but before I get there, I want to mention that Father FitzGerald posed some questions about the origin of the universe and the origin of life. And these will be addressed tomorrow in detail in the conversation at 1 o'clock. What does God actually do? So now I want to thank the panel for their very insightful questions, and it's time for your questions to Rabbi Dorff and Father FitzGerald. And there's a very interesting question. I think that you're going to give an interesting answer. And this relates to climate science and religious belief. So one participant is concerned about how to address science denialism that people sometimes justify with reference to religious belief. So can I throw that open, first of all, to Father FitzGerald?
Sure. So the idea that one's own religious beliefs would lead one to a particular scientific stance, right, is, again, I think something both Rabbi Dorff and I have been talking about, maybe not as directly as this, in terms of saying that's not what religion does, right? So religion is not saying how the universe began, how it might or might not end, you know, how life began, all those sorts of things. What religion is saying is, why are we here? And where are we hoping to go? So if somebody says, my religion does not allow me to accept that scientific conclusion, for instance, evolution, right? And just so everybody knows, the Catholic Church never had a problem with evolution as a scientific theory. It's when people tried to take evolution and say, because evolution is a good theory scientifically, it therefore then can become a good worldview and we can get rid of God. Well, that's just a ludicrous proposition, but that was an attempt that was made. So oftentimes when I see statements like that being made, I would argue that there's a fallacious reasoning going on. And what you've got to do then is just pick that apart and show that in fact, there isn't a scientific theory or a proposition that your religion either includes or excludes. But what your religion is trying to do is engage that.
And Rabbi Dorff, do you feel the same?
I think the thing that is really important here is that, is what Father FitzGerald was saying, namely that religion, you don't go to religion to find out scientific facts. I mean, that's the reason why we have science to begin with, right? And for religion to deny what is clearly evidenced in science, it's just crazy. I mean, it's not the way. It's certainly not going to be my faith by a long shot. I mean, the Deuteronomy chapter 6 says you have to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That means you can't say that what I believe in one area of life is going to be totally, frankly, schizophrenically divided from what I believe in other parts of from my religion. My religion has to include everything that I learned from science. And if climate change is real, which it definitely is, and we've got all kinds of evidence of it, then as a religious community, we have to do everything we can to engage our politicians and our other leaders to try to help us deal with that, and try to help us, because if we cannot live on this planet, nothing else matters, right? So, I mean, the issue here is just face reality. By the way, in another case like this, you know, there's a part of my people, the ultra-Orthodox, who are simply, they're not social distancing, they're not wearing masks, they're, you know, and have problems with vaccines. And so in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox are about 11% of the population, 40% of those who have died from COVID. That's what happens when you deny science, right? It is just self-defeating, and it's certainly not religiously mandated. It's not even religiously acceptable. So, I mean, I think that if anything, what we need to do as religious leaders is to tell our people science is real. Actually, there's a sign outside my house that says science is real, climate change is real, right? And so that along with Black Lives Matter and kindness is everything. That's what that sign says. So, I mean, I think we need to make it very clear that when we have clear scientific evidence for things, we need to learn how to make that part of our lives.
A very important issue, I think. And we've got another interesting question. And can we imagine a religion without a God entity and still address all the same questions supposedly answered by or assigned to the term and mystery of God's entity? So I really think the questioner seems to be asking, do we know if science can replace God? And so how about Father FitzGerald give a...
I was going to say, I'm not sure this is where the questioner was going, but there are religious traditions or traditions that are considered religious in a sort that don't necessarily have a God attached, more a philosophy of life or a philosophy of meaning of existence. So I remember I was in China and talking with some graduate students there. And, you know, they found out that I was a priest and a Catholic and all that. And they were fascinated by the idea that there could be a personal God, a God that you could relate to personally. That was completely outside of their, you know, understanding and even imagination. So we had a marvelously fascinating conversation. So I wouldn't, if you're trying to say, is it religion versus science, that it's not even necessarily God versus science. But I think that raises a really important question in terms of people who want to say there's a way of being, a way of living your life that's just scientific, and you don't need any of that extraneous stuff, right? And I think Rabbi Dorff and I have already kind of tried to make clear that actually nobody lives that way. I believe maybe B.F. Skinner attempted it, maybe to the most extreme of anyone, and I don't think it worked out too well for his children. So it just doesn't work. You cannot do that because there's always values that are going to come in. There's always goals that are going to come in, and that doesn't come from science. That comes from wherever you bring it from. You can call it science, but it isn't.
And Rabbi Dorff?
Sure, very much along those lines. This is probably more philosophy than the questioner wanted, but here we go. There's the level, in terms of human experience, there's the level of the concrete. So that's tables, chairs, people, okay? Then there's the first level of abstraction. Things like justice and beauty and truth, right? You can know when something is just or unjust, but it's really difficult to define what justice is. That's starting with Plato. There are all kinds of philosophers that have tried to define what justice is, right? We know that it's really important, and so is truth, and so is beauty, and so is existence, and so on, right? We know those things. So is love. What is love, right? We know those things are really important, and they're very much parts of our lives, but they're not concrete. And then the same, they have concrete manifestations, but they themselves are not concrete. And then you have a level of abstraction above that, called in philosophy, it's called metaphysics. In religion, it's called theology, right? Which is, what is the container of it all, right? In other words, what is the, he's got the whole world in his hands, that kind of stuff, right? In other words, what is the whole container of all of our experience? Now, in religious terms, what that is, one of the things that distinguishes religion from philosophy on this is that the very word religion, the L-I-G in religion, means to connect. It's a bond, right? So your ligaments are your connective tissue, right? Sometimes when a woman has had as many children that she wants, she has a tubal ligation, or tubes are tied. It's the same Latin root, right? So what religion is all about is our connections to both the first level of abstraction, or our connections to the concrete world, our connections to the first level of abstraction, but also our connections to the second level of abstraction, which religions tend to anthropomorphize, so that it's more easily you can connect to the higher level more easily, right? But if you look at religious philosophers, people like Maimonides that Hava talked about before, they don't like that kind of anthropomorphism at all, right? So you get religious philosophers, rabbis in that case, right? And by the way, Aquinas also, right, did not like any of this anthropomorphization, but very much were religious thinkers. And they were trying to give us a sense of connection to that larger abstraction that we are all aware of, right? To pretend that you're not aware of it is either you're denying what you know, or you haven't been attuned to that area of human experience yet. So I mean, so can there be religion without God? Well, depends. Well, there can be religion without a personal God. That there can be, right? There can be religion, but I frankly think that that's truncated, right? Because look, in our human experience, we experience other human beings as having personalities, and we think that's better than a stone that doesn't have a personality, right? So why shouldn't we, if having a personality is an enhancement of existence, then why should we not attribute that to God, right? That's what I would say. But there are certainly people who connect to metaphysics in ways that are not personal.
Thank you. It just leaves us time for a very brief answer from both of you for our last question. And this comes from Stephen Hoffman. And in our highly diverse and opinionated society, what is the best way to bring people together in accepting the notion that religion and science can be integrated? That's our last question. Just a minute from each of you, please.
Have discussions like this one. No, I mean that very seriously. I mean, show people that people who are really connected to both religion and science are not doing that in a kind of intellectually schizophrenic way. They really are trying to integrate that within themselves, and they're trying to integrate that within the community that they serve. And people from different religious traditions and people with different scientific views, maybe even, or different areas of science that they practice, right? And try to show people that that this kind of conversation is not one in which people are going to automatically yell at each other or just diss each other, as my students say, right? But rather that it's going to be something that's going to be respectful and actually advance human knowledge and human ability to communicate.
Well, I think this has been very respectful so far. So, Father FitzGerald, would you like to comment?
Oh, I'm going to hate to ruin our track record. No, I'm only kidding. I would agree. And I'd also ask this. I think it's not so much nowadays that the divisiveness is due to religion versus science. I think the division is due to other things, and religion and science are being used to support or justify divisive goals that don't have anything to do with religion or science per se. So when somebody says that, I mean, I'm all for empirical data. Show me the empirical data that says, religion is bad or science is bad, right? Now, a person who claims to be representing a religion or representing science and doing something, that's totally different. Anybody can claim anything. What you have to then do is look at both who the person is. Are they really using science or religion? Or is there something else going on? And what's their goal? So
that's all we've got time for. I think that that's,
thank you.
you know, you're looking for credibility, aren't you, as much as anything else? But
think we
there,
all have to do
words
that.
into your mouth. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So thanks to you, our wonderful panelists, Hava, Tirosh-Samuelson, Paul Carrese and Ben Hurlbut, and a huge thank you to our special guests, Father Kevin FitzGerald and Rabbi Elliot Dorff. And of course, you, the audience, for your fantastic questions. And that's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. when our program continues, starting with a conversation towards a humane economy. I'm Pauline Davies.
Bye now.
Thank you so much.